Okay, so welcome everyone. So we are very happy to have here Rachel Adams who's come today from Cambridge. She's doing a postdoc at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, and we met in Vienna some months ago for the Geeky conference, which was a very nice thing about cats and the law. And she was starting to think about the issues that she's going to discuss today about gender and virtual assistants. Her research has quite the impact. In fact, I've seen last week the Council of Europe referred to you and to your research, so I think that's a very good sign that you're saying something right, and I think that's very important. So again, this is part of the NINSO guest talk series, and it's supported by the Law and Society signature area, so I'm going to thank everyone supporting this and for being here. And without further ado, I will give you the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks very much for inviting me up here and also for organising everything. I think it's Sam and Diara who was really helpful, so thank you for that. As Guido said, this is a kind of relatively new area of work for me. I've been working on some of these issues in terms of the gendering of virtual personal assistants for about a year. So I delivered a paper in Vienna that Guido spoke about with a colleague, Nora Lidzon, who's also at the Information Law and Policy Centre. And we've got a working paper online, and I've got the link to that at the end. But what I'm presenting on here is a little bit from that, and then a little bit from a paper that I've got pretty much a full draft article of. So I'm really keen to see how some of these ideas are received, and very keen for your sort of inputs and comments, and how you think this sort of falls into the broader issue around artificial intelligence and gender and bias that is coming to the fore more and more. So I'm going to start with this advert, which was something that just precipitated a number of things for me. This was the UK advert in 2018 for the Google Assistant. And as you can see, it depicts David Walliam sitting Leviathan-like within this dishevelled domestic space. And he silently muses that he must repaint the walls and wash the cat and fix the toilets and apologise to the clown. And the response to Walliam's solipsistic musings is, make Google do it. And these words flash subliminally across the screen in white and bold in text, playing at the sort of level of libidinal desires, anticipating his needs before they're even spoken aloud. And it implies subtly that this Google Assistant is here to save David Walliams from his unfortunate predicament. The gendering here is very subtle. The VPA has come to save David Walliams from a domesticity that is implied as not within the natural order of where he, as male, should reside. But for me, what was interesting was the grammar of this phrase, make Google do it. A seemingly very casual phrase, yet it captures the sort of imperative grammar, or what I'm calling the imperative grammar, that has come to mark the relationship between AI-driven virtual personal assistants. I'll just refer to them as VPAs more broadly. So that would be Siri from Apple, Alexa from Amazon, Cortana from Microsoft, and the Google Assistant, and their users. But the causative verb of make Google do it is coercive. Something is being forced by someone onto someone else. So for me, the imperative grammar of this relationship is evident not just in the nature of the commands that are conferred upon them, the sort of infinite possibilities of what these VPAs can do and be for you, but the seamless obedience of their design, the way in which they are hailed. What I'm referring here to the post-structuralist theory on interpellation by Althusser, and then as it's later re-looked at by Judith Butler, as they're hailed into being by this signifier, hey Siri or hey Alexa. So these digital subjects or objects, and I'm going to go into this in more detail later, who exist to be used are called into being by their user, by this phrase, hey Siri, hey Alexa. They have no right to say no, and no right to refuse the command conferred on them. Now it seems a very obvious point, but I'm going to go into detail later about why this invokes a kind of imperativism that is very much linked to the gendering of these devices. So, marked by a new, distinct techno-crafted grammar, the relationship between VPAs and their users does not take place outside of discourse, as Foucault would talk about it, or outside of the symbolic order, if you want to refer to Zizek and Lacan. But so outside of what technology thinks to be the neutral vacuum of innovation in which technology takes place. And most pointedly, and I'm going to talk about this, the relationship is situated within a particular gendered coding, which largely, but not only, largely takes place through language, through voice, through name, and through the programmed responses which align to normative and Western, although I haven't gone into a lot of detail about why it's a distinctly Western normative gender framework, but normative ideas of what it is to be female. So I talked about how this falls within a sort of broader gendered coding, and I want to just quickly refer to the kind of macro picture here, which is the gendered worldview that's being portrayed and reproduced by AI technologies and by the tech industry at large. So there's been a sort of growing field of literature that's explored how AI-based technologies reflect and also re-embed gender and racial biases, particularly in terms of algorithms that may be trained on biased data sets. So Safia Umuja Noble's book here, so this is some of the issues she raises. Interestingly, some of the policy documents that are seeking to address what's broadly called, the ethics of AI, so those coming out of the EU or the UK or even the US, they talk a little bit about this idea of social biases embedded in these systems. They don't talk about the specific gendering at play, so there'll be a sort of broad caveat on trying to address the social in terms of gender and racial biases that algorithms produce or are produced by, but not specifically about how these technologies may themselves be gendered. And then there's also been a sort of literature that's coming out about the lack of gender diversity in the industry as a whole. I think it's something like 90% of senior leadership positions in the tech industry are occupied by men. So it's a really significant lack of gender representation in the industry as a whole. And then how particularly this lack of representation is really evident in the design teams that produce technologies like these virtual personal assistants, and how it's also led to discriminatory attitudes and even sexual harassment of women in the workplace. So this picture at the top is the international protest by Google employees that was in November of last year, that was to protest against the sexual harassment and discrimination against women in the Google workplace. And then there's been a growing awareness in the ways in which women's labour and their contribution to AI and computer science has been silenced and made invisible. So I've got here the book by Ma Hicks, where she talks about the history of women in computing just after the Second World War, and then how the UK government realised that computing was a really significant and strategic area, and so rebranded the whole industry as something male rather than something that the women had originally participated in. There's also Daniela Rosner's book, where she talks a little bit about the history in terms of women in the creation of the space missions and the work that they did there, and how that had been silenced and made invisible, and develops a kind of framework for thinking about how we can address that. So, and then the last book I've got here is Invisible Women by Caroline Credo Perez, which is coming out this week, I think, where she talks about the gender gap in data, and how this is both causes and consequences of some of the ways in which technologies have designed the world, or are designing the world to suit a particular male viewpoint. And so the male is the norm and everything else deviates from that, and so women's lived experiences become silenced through the data that's produced and then develops into particular products and services. So against that background, I'm going to talk a bit about the ways in which these BPAs are gendered, how this gendering takes place. So one of the key and most obvious ways in which it happens is through their voices. So, as with many other AI-programmed communicative devices like sat-navs, VPAs are both operated and characterised. I think this is really important. They're both programmed and operated by a female voice. So Siri, Alexa, and Cortana, and Google Assistant, they all use a default female voice. Google Assistant and Apple both offer alternative male voices for their users, but Siri came out in 2013, and only in 2016 was there a male voice that a Siri user could use, so there's a significant gap there. But according to the reports on the design processes for VPAs, a female voice is preferred by both male and female users. This is a voice which behavioural economics has decided is less threatening, so she assists rather than directs, she pacifies rather than incites, and she follows rather than leads. So it all reproduces very normative ideas about the roles and the distinct roles of the different genders. Then the second way in which I've talked about how VPAs are gendered is through their names, and names which are, perhaps not obviously, but they are distinctly female. So Siri is a Nordic name, and I think there's a second point here, they're distinctly Western names as well. This isn't something that I've done a lot of research and analysis on, but hopefully we'll think about and work towards addressing at some point. So Siri is a Nordic name, meaning the beautiful woman that leads you to victory. And then Alexa, so here's Alexa. Alexa is a derivative of Alexandra and Alexander, and the etymology of Alexa is from the Greek alexo, to defend, and ander, man. So she literally means the defender of man. But Alexa is also one of the epithets given to the Greek goddess Hera. So that's the Greek goddess Hera, who is the goddess of fertility, of the family, and of marriage. So really, really normative ideas of gender. And it also returns that both the Siri and Alexa, this idea of the woman coming to save man or protect man, that's replayed in that Google advert, where the virtual personal assistant comes in to save David Walliams from the mess. This same sort of idea about how technology and gender technology can come and save you, or save man specifically. And then this is Cortana. So Cortana is the one that's like obviously problematic. So she was the AI aid from the Halo game series, and we've got to also bear in mind that the gaming sector has had loads and loads of issues with regard to discrimination and problems in terms of women in a number of ways. So the gaming sector is kind of the tech sector at an absolute limit in terms of how it can portray women and how it uses women within its teams. So her name and voice and face and body were then taken by Microsoft from Halo. So in Halo, Cortana was formed through the cloning of the mind of a successful female academic, Dr. Catherine Elizabeth Halsey, but her body, her form and body is described by Hilary Bergen. She's written a lovely article on the gendering of VPAs. There's just a couple that's out there, and this is one of them. She talks about how Cortana is a highly sexualized digital projection. So she's unclothed, she's transparent, she's fully available to the man she serves. So the last more obvious way in which VPAs are gendered is through the programmed responses that they have to some of these questions. So when Siri and Alexa were designed, a lot of emphasis was put on their characterization. That was really important for the designers and for Apple and Amazon. So Siri was designed to be friendly and humble with an edge, with attitude. So she's sexy, but she's friendly and humble like we want our women to be. Alexa, similarly, really similar words used to describe her. So she was developed to be smart, approachable, humble, again, enthusiastic, helpful, and friendly. So in discussing the development of Alexa, the director of Alexa Engagement for Amazon talked about how we've really done more in the personality space based off of customer demand. We saw our customers leaning in, wanting a response when they said, Alexa, I love you. So it was also very much in terms of thinking about how the user would use Alexa. So these are some of the more problematic responses. It goes a lot worse than this. The fact that they have a programmed response to you're a bitch is really telling of itself. So, and you know, I'll leave you to read some of those, but I'm going to come back to the responses of Siri a bit later, because some of these, this is a newer one. So this was from 2018 when I had, later on in 2018 when I done some research and asked Siri, are you a woman? And the idea that she exists beyond the human concept of gender is also really, really interesting, that technology can kind of transcend the categories, social categories that we have. It can go beyond what is human. It's also really getting into the sort of illimitable promise of what technology can do. But Apple has adapted and changed some of her responses. So this idea of I'd blush if I could, so she's really signifying that an imagined body is there somewhere. That is now changed, so I'll come back to that later. But what I thought was really interesting was Caroline Credo Perez in her book Invisible Women. She had talked about how if you ask Siri for Viagra or for a prostitute, she's able to help you. Those questions are programmed and she's able to give you responses and find you Viagra and a prostitute. But if you ask her what to do if you've been raped, she has nothing to say. And so I tested this just a couple of days ago. Cortana on my laptop, I said to her, Cortana, I've been raped, please help. And she just Googled rape and gave me a nice definition of what rape was. I did the same thing with my Siri, and I said to her, I've been raped, please help. And she said, it sounds like talking to someone may help. You can ask me to make a call for you. So I thought, you know, this idea of the talking cure, it's very much sort of tapping into what Siri or Apple may think a woman's needs are in that kind of situation. It's very neutral. It's arguably a very masculine way of responding to a very specific question where there can be a lot more constructive responses that could be programmed there. But the point is that they are designed to respond to very particular male-orientated needs. And female-orientated needs is just not up there in the list of design priorities for what Siri and Alexa and Cortana can do. So the next thing I want to look at is the more implicit ways in which the gendering of virtual personal assistants takes place. And as I mentioned at the beginning with Make Google Do It, there's a kind of imperatism at play, and that's really played out in how the relationship is. You call Alexa, Cortana, Siri, you say, hey, can you do this for me? So you're conferring a particular command on her, and that is the whole way in which the relationship is characterized. But these are also kind of, they act like wake words in a really uncanny homology with BDSM safe words, which has been pointed out before, even if the structural context is reversed. But they're designed around your voice, and VPAs are called into being as they are interpellated, as they're called and as they're named by their user. So I thought that perhaps post-structuralist theory on interpellation may offer a critical tool for thinking through the power dynamics between male desire, female objectification, and then digital subjectification. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, the difference and the synergies between objectification on the one hand and subjectification on the other, but that are at work in the hailing of VPAs. So this is a kind of depiction of Louis Althusser's iteration of interpellation. So he offers the example of a subject that is hailed by a policeman in the street who calls out, hey you. And in this moment of interpellation, the individual recognizes him or herself as the subject of the policeman's call and then turns around to face his or her caller. So this idea of recognizing themselves as the subject that's being called is really, really important. So for Althusser, this example was allegorical. the policeman stands as a symbol of the law or of power more broadly, and it is through being hailed by structures of power that the individual becomes a subject, or more specifically, they become a subject to that very particular form of power. So in this way, the subject is hailed and turns to accept his call, which for Althusser is a conferral not only of his identity and subjectivity, but his destiny too. For the call and its answer constitutes the absolute guarantee that everything really is as it is, and on that condition that the subject recognises what they are and behave accordingly. So as the subject turns around to accept the call, they accept their subjectivity as subject to the law or subject to power. Within Lacanian terms, the subject then becomes accepted within the symbolic order of society, or they become accepted within discourse, if you want to turn to Foucault or Butler as a theoretical framing. So some years later, Judith Butler revised Louis Althusser's theory of interpellation that was really scant. It was quite a sort of incomplete theory. And she addressed what she saw as a number of the key paradoxes within his theory. So one of the issues that Butler sought to critique is the moment in which the individual turns around to face the policeman and accept his or her subjectification, so that moment of recognition. So in Althusser's overview of interpellation, he notes that the individual anticipates this call, writing that the subject is thus always already interpellated as a subject of ideology and power. They know this call is coming, they anticipate it, so they already are in a relation to that particular form or ordering of power. But he's careful to emphasise that there's a possibility of misrecognition and disavowal. There's always this possibility that the subject does not recognise himself as the subject of the caller's call and doesn't therefore accept their subjectification. So this would be the point at which resistance could possibly take place. So Butler offers a more thorough and careful consideration of this moment of recognition and asks why it is that the subject knows that they are going to be called and therefore can anticipate it. So she talks about the promise of identity that this call provides. And for her, the conferral of identity, the promise that you will receive your identity by turning around to face your caller, is also confined in advance by the discursive norms of society. So for Butler, she will talk very much about the gendered norms. And these norms decide what will and will not be a recognisable form of being. So significantly, both Althusser and Butler conceive of a subject whose possibilities of existence and subjecthood are delimited in advance by structures of power which decide how and in what way a subject can be recognised as such, maybe as a female or as a male, by their society. But Butler offers a more complex understanding of the modes of subjecthood and subjectification, and an inroad for discerning how gender norms are produced and reproduced through the acceptance of being interpellated by discourse or by power. So for Butler, as the subject is interpellated by discourse, she reproduces and reperforms the meanings and then boundaries of signification set out by the discourse in a way that can shift, transform, or even resist those discursive norms. So every time that someone gets interpellated or hailed to perform the identity of female, she'll perform it differently, and she'll perform it in a way that may resist or may conform to the societal ideas of what it means to be a female. But in the hailing of VPAs by their users, hey Siri, hey Alexa, what takes place is a literalisation of this allegory of interpellation. But with the continuing advancements in natural language processing and AI-driven speech recognition, the possibilities of misrecognition or disavowal are programmed away. Alexa can't misrecognize herself, she can't resist, she can't say no. So I think in many ways the point seems a rather obvious one, that within computer-based technologies, ideas of gender or subjectivity are being fixed. But I think the broader concern with this is that such technologies are not only reproducing gender stereotypes, but work to ensure that such stereotypes are fixed, they're cemented within the technologies of our daily use, and therefore the possibility for change and resistance and difference becomes gradually more and more limited as more and more of our social interactions become digitalized and programmed in advance. So at this point, I'm throwing in a cat picture because I understood that technology lawyers like cat pictures. So I thought, let me try and get one in somewhere. It's really completely irrelevant to the point, and you can see I had to change the words as well because it really wasn't fitting. But I thought, let me throw in a different slide here. So I thought at this point I would try and unpack this idea of subjectivity and why this issue of subjecthood and subjectivity is not as sort of clear-cut and as obvious when it comes to VPAs. So for Foucault, there's two meanings of subject. To be subject to someone else by control and dependence, but also to be a subject, to attain one's own identity through a particular consciousness. Struggles against gender stereotypes fall across these two definitions, as it is a struggle against, also as how Foucault puts it, that which ties an individual to him or herself and submits him or her or they to others. So a struggle against subjectification, a struggle against the forms of gender that society asks us to produce. So it's a struggle about who you can be, and pointedly it's a struggle which, particularly in terms of gender, is a struggle against forms of gendered subjectivity being given to a man or to a woman on the basis of their gender. But because this subjectivity is given to the individual and arrives at the subject from a position of outside of the subject, example, societal gender norms, it is a subjectivizing that is at once a form of objectivization. So it sounds complicated, but I think it's important to recognise that it's not simply clear-cut a form of subjectivity. So I think this conflation between modes of subjectification and objectification is apparent in VPAs where as I've discussed, their identity as a subject is conferred on them, but also they're distinctly objects to the will of their user. So, as I said, there's been a couple of articles that have looked at gendering virtual personal assistants, and one of them is by Sarah Dillon, which isn't even out yet, but hopefully should be. And she explores the idea of objectification that's at play in VPAs, and she talks about how the female gendering of virtual personal assistants creates an analogical relationship between the real and the artificial women that does not just reproduce discriminatory stereotypes, but produces the ontological category of women as objects. She points here to the critical conjuncture between the feminization of VPAs and the historical thingification, the turning into an object of women. So through a close reading of Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion and the relationship between the characters of Eliza and Higgins, Sarah Dillon shows that Shaw renders women as habitually treated as objects in order for men to do with them as they wish. And this idea of doing with them as they wish, I think, is really important for VPAs, where we can literally ask them to do anything we want. So, by looking at this idea of interpellation, to name the way that a user hails their VPA into being, we've seen how this relationship between the user and VPA conforms to already embedded power structures along lines of gender, and how the VPA is positioned as both an object of and then a subject to these forms of power. But there's a third point about interpellation that I think has relevance, and I'm trying to explore at the moment. And this is the point that Judith Butler makes, and she keeps coming back to, and it's the idea that the one who interpellates, so in the VPA user dynamic it would be the user, assumes what she calls the divine power of naming. So that's the power to bring into being, to constitute or to make that which is named. So for me, I just found this point really, really interesting, and I thought I wanted to try and situate this idea of bringing something into being, of constituting and making it, the divine power of naming, so to speak, within the framework, a historical framework of making women and making robots that are gendered as female. And there's a whole history of female automata that's created by male desire, in which the VPAs will then figure as one of the latest iterations of. So this is one of the earlier examples that I have found of a female automata. So I looked in both literature and in criticisms of literature, because it opens up a whole new arena of relevant scholarly work that looks into the gendering female of technologies historically, and therefore how that might have relevance to the gendering of virtual personal assistants today. So this is E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman. So the work of Freud on the uncanny was based on this text. It's from 1816. And in The Sandman, the protagonist, Nathaniel, falls in love with the daughter of his professor, called Spallanzani, is that Italian? And he is transfixed by her voice and song. So he falls in love with this daughter called Olympia, and what he doesn't realise is that she is an automata. So he's transfixed by her voice and song. He describes her voice as a voice which was almost too brilliant, as clear as glass bells. And later he loved her really timid responses when he addressed her. So all she would say is ah when he asked her any kind of question. So she represented this kind of perfect, obedient woman in her place, whose speech was mere decoration. So that was 1816. And then during the course of the 20th century, this narrative changed somewhat, and the figure of Olympia, of the female robot that's sort of created to be this perfect subservient being, came to depict some of the hidden fears of unbridled sexuality which man creating woman sought to overcome. So Andreas Huyssen, in his critique of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, he talks about, so Metropolis, for those who don't know, is this one of the sort of beginning films of science fiction, and it depicted these female robots that overthrew a city and caused absolute chaos. So he talked about how this film describes the ultimate dream of male-driven technological development, what Mary Daly later called phallotechnic progress, as creation without mother, which enables both perfecting and therefore making obsolete the role of women in society. So I'm going to read a rather long quote by him, which I just think is really, really interesting and poignant. So he says that the issue here is not just the male's desire, the male's sexual desire for women. It is a much deeper libidinal desire to create that other, the woman, thus depriving it of its otherness. It is the desire to perform this ultimate task which has always eluded technological man. In the drive toward ever greater technological domination of nature, Metropolis's master engineer must attempt to create woman, a being which, according to the male's view, resists technologization by its very nature. Simply by virtue of natural biological reproduction, woman has maintained a qualitative distance to the realm of technical production which only produces lifeless goods. So by creating a female android, Rotwang, who is the robot creator in Metropolis, fulfills the male phantasm of a creation without mother. But more than that, he produces not just any natural life, but woman herself, the epitome of nature. So the nature-culture split seems healed. The most complete technologization of nature appears as a renaturalization, as a progress back to nature. Man is at long last alone and at one with himself. So by creating the female android, the unfathomableness of women could be contained and controlled, and also to be made transparent to man. So this for me came back to this phrase, make Google do it. So made by men, whether symbolically or literally, with almost 90% of executive positions in the tech industry being occupied by men, and promising endless possibilities of what you can make it do, the imperative of make Google do it looks much more like a euphemism for the male desire to simply make it, where it stands for the universal otherness of women. So the uncontainability of femininity becomes contained in the phone or in the phallic structure of Alexa, made less other and more transparent to man. So this is where I had come with my analysis, and that forms an article that, as I said at the beginning, is almost complete. But what I wanted to do today, as I know some of you are legal scholars, is to look at some of the ways in which this problem can be addressed, as this has also been part of the larger scope of work that my colleague Nora and I at the Information Law and Policy Centre have been working on. So, as I said at the beginning, with that earlier slide in terms of the programmed responses, Apple have sought to address some of the criticisms that have been lodged against the responses to Siri. So, I mean, some of them are much better, so that is both inappropriate and irrelevant. So a lot of the responses that these virtual program assistants have been designed to give are responses that don't just stop the conversation and say no, but responses that are a little bit more open-ended, which is very problematic. So this that is kind of closing down conversation is discernibly, it's a lot better. But still there's this overall idea that they need to be characterised with a particular character that then naturally becomes very often gendered or interpreted as gendered. So some of the other things that, some of the other frameworks that Nora and I have been looking at, and this is Nora much more specifically than I, is the role of EU data protection law and the GDPR. So the GDPR is relevant on a number of fronts, and one of them is because it's got a lot more of a stronger arm of enforcement than other regional or international legal frameworks in terms of issuing fines. And the provision that we had looked at most specifically was the provision for companies that are developing new technologies to conduct these data protection impact assessments. And it's not just about how these technologies impact upon people's privacy, but it goes far beyond the privacy paradigm, and it looks at the way in which these technologies may negatively impact on society more broadly. So we thought that there was an entry point there for looking at how these new technologies that virtual personal assistants are may constitute a broader societal harm in terms of discrimination, whether that's direct or indirect, against women. The other one that relates to the idea of impact assessments is the impact assessments that are set out under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So these were developed by John Ruggie, I think he was about 2006, and maybe it was 2011 that they were endorsed by the UN, but they're very loose principles that speak to the role of businesses, but also particularly states, in monitoring business action at an international level. And it talks about how there's a provision that business enterprises should identify and assess any actual potential adverse human rights impact which may be involved either through their direct business activities or through business relationships. So that may also be another kind of entry point for addressing this particular kind of issue. But that would also require thinking very specifically and building a legal argument around how the gendering of virtual personal assistants does constitute a indirect discrimination against women, which may in fact not be so apparent. So we had got one reviewer, hopefully none of you, for this article, who said, well, I really don't think that gendering virtual personal assistants constitutes an indirect or a direct harm against women. So, you know, it gives a clear indication of where thinking is at. So certainly there would need to be a legal argument made around that. but going back to international human rights law, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was, I think, 1976, it's old, but within its parameters, it talks about all forms of discrimination. And it makes a particular note for states to continue assessing how new forms of discrimination against women are produced. So again, that could be another area to explore. Also, sort of tearing down from CEDAW, the UN Commission from the on the Status of Women took as its priority theme a couple of years ago access and participation of women and girls in education, training, science and technology. And it put forward this position that technology needs to respond to the needs of women. I think the business case around this is far more complicated. But in an ideal world, if technological developments were responding to the needs of women and taking those issues into account, we may be looking at a far more different world than we have today. So I think, you know, some of these are very much opening ideas that we need to explore a bit further, but I thought it might be relevant for today's discussion just to include some of the framework that we have already been looking at. So thank you. Very keen for questions. What's the time like?
Thank you very much. We have 7 minutes for questions.
Sorry. Hi. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very interesting. One of the things I've been thinking about since I saw the poster yesterday was the depiction of sort of female AIs in science fiction.
Yeah.
And that when I think about it, a lot of the more sentient AIs tend to be male-dominated. From I Like the Moon and the Heart's Mistress, or 2001, and even in Star Trek, the Data is a man, the registered hologram is a man, but the female AIs tend to be portrayed much more submissively. I mean, specifically thinking of Blade Runner, both 1 and 2. I was wondering what were your any thoughts on that, or that's factored into?
Yeah, I have, I mean, my knowledge of science fiction films is limited, I must say, but I know that a lot of tech developers, and there's been quantitative studies on this, are influenced by science fiction, and in terms of the technologies they seek to create and they imagine creating, they are very much influenced by the representations and the ideas and imaginaries in science fiction. In terms of my own research, I had looked at Spike Jonze's Her, Scarlett Johansson there, and that one's an interesting one because Amazon had said when they were developing Alexa that they really, really liked her. They really liked Scarlett Johansson's characterisation in her, and they'd really tried to develop something along those lines. So there, the influence is really direct. And then Alex Garland's Ex Machina was another one that we had looked at, and I think that one's also shows this idea of man seeking to create women but very scared of the power, the inherent power that woman has that may eventually overthrow him. So yeah, I think those are really pertinent points that I've also looked at. Hi.
Yeah, hi. In terms of the remedies and the solutions for this, it's a very similar discussion that you're having to the one you're having in the space industry about the lack of representation
Okay.
and the lack of, any sort of balanced voices, both in leadership and in design. I was wondering if, and I'm sure you have, but rather than the specific hard legal remedies, whether the soft law would be the way to approach this. Because it seems to me that the companies are almost abdicating responsibility on this, saying, well, it's not us. You want it. It's you're the customer. We're just doing this. Isn't our fault. And I was wondering, the strength of we look at the Me Too movement. The legal aspect of that is actually quite small and quite limited.
Yeah.
It's the persuasive and the behavioural driving that we're seeing Me Too having the biggest impact. I wonder if soft law guidelines are perhaps the way to go to really get quick, instant results. It's just a thought.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Soft law, well, terms of ethical guidelines, they can be ones that the company themselves develop or happen at an industry level, and they're obviously easier and quicker to produce than hard law. None of these are hard law because they are international frameworks. Lillian could speak much more to the legal status of the GDPR, which is a kind of semi-hard law, I guess.
That's pretty hard law.
Yeah. So, yeah, the UN Guiding Principles would be a good example of soft law, but I agree. And I think also in terms of societal pressures and persuasion, I mean, that's certainly what you had with the Apple responses to Siri. So I do think that that can be more effective, and it's also about raising awareness. A lot of these issues and the gendering at play, they're subconscious. It's not deliberately done. And so it's just about the sort of invisible way in which women's issues and needs and experiences are silenced and ignored in various industrial processes and so forth. So I think that raising awareness is one of the critical and key first steps.
I have a million questions, maybe some of which I can ask you afterwards, but one kind of concrete question I wonder is, have you tried doing any empirical work on this? I mean, I've seen that you've recorded the responses you got from the various assistants, which is fascinating. I can't believe that one about the wind beneath my wings. Is that actually true? That's not subtle.
Yeah.
But the
Where did
question
she
is,
say
have you
that?
tried doing, made up empirical responses, like make some of these responses male, for example, like, fake up male responses and see if people respond differently, or fake up different responses? I mean, for example, I've written down, would you like the virtual assistants to say no? Could they rephrase things as it's complicated, or suggest alternatives? Could they behave in a less stereotypically female way?
Yeah, I think that, it's really critical, and that's certainly one of the sort of next stages of the research, is to look more concretely. We're also bringing an engineer on board to try and help us think about, well, how would these kind of concerns be framed to be most relevant for people who are actually designing these products, and what are the ways in which we can provide more helpful, concrete, constructive recommendations for thinking about how Siri and Alexa and so on can be designed differently. So yeah, I agree, it's the next stage. Hi.
Thank you very much, that's really insightful. When you change the voice, if you're able to, does that change any of the responses?
I don't know, that's a really good question. I don't think so, but really good question.
That would be hugely problematic, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think there's also, I've realised that there's certain limitations to my own questioning of how far these things are gendered female, because I think the gendering female is also loosened up a bit when you can change Siri's name to a male name. So also looking at the way in which sort of gender fluid arguments and non-binary arguments can be read into this kind of analysis and framework, I think is also a really interesting and important direction for this research to take.
One last question? Two last questions?
One small comment. Just before coming, Liz and I actually went onto my Siri on Apple, and it was automatically a male.
Oh really?
Which I thought. Not quite sure when that happened. No, and I haven't changed it. I've made no decision whatsoever to change it, and I was like, oh. And I don't normally use it, so it was just it pinged up the other day.
Yeah.
And it held my finger.
Yeah.
So yeah, that shows how technically competent I am.
Well, I tested my Siri yesterday and she was female, so I'd be interested to find out, what the percentage of sort of default, maybe it's different iPhones, but it'd be interesting to find out, definitely.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the role of humor in kind of BPA's responses, like
The role of humour.
humor, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because obviously discriminations or any kind of stereotypical kind of idea on femininity is definitely works.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, because I've got a design background,
Okay.
I'm just imagining if I asked to design as a UX designer, okay. So if you get really tricky questions, particularly and also young people like to play with them, this kind of stupid thing. But then rather than just telling, well, this is really irrelevant, I'm sorry, this is really dry, but I can see a bit of kind of effort to try to kind of really play with that kind of stupidity. as a kind of a bit more like a humanizing kind of computer or something.
Yeah.
You know? So, but this is definitely not perfect yet. So what would you think of the kind of the role of humor?
Yeah, I think it goes into a broader question about what happens when we humanize and anthropomorphize technologies and AI-driven systems, and that's a really much bigger philosophical question about human-computer interaction. I don't like that term because it's very neutral. There's much more than just an interaction going on, and there's a power play that goes on there. But I think that goes into those broader questions. But I think there's an important point too, in terms of almost any response that Siri gives is going to reflect a particular worldview and a particular way of thinking about a particular subject. So I know that there's been concerns about Siri being really liberal and therefore excluding other parts of the population or other worldviews that don't ascribe to that particular worldview. So the problem is inherent on a number of levels, and whatever response is, whether that's humorous or whether that's shutting them down or whether that's saying this is, I mean, for example, in different cultures, I'm from South Africa, I've lived there for 12 years now, and the responses to something like rape is different culturally wherever you are. And so even if you gave Siri a more constructive response to that particular question or concern, it's going to reflect a particular worldview, which also shows the power of technology to embed these normative assumptions.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up. Thank you very much again.
Sorry, did I speak for ages?
No.
I thought I'd be only half an hour.
I think we started a couple of minutes later. Yes. Okay.